In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the things that impact Canadians today that maybe you don't understand how they got their start or where they got their origins from and why they are, in some cases, not really accurate or important to the Canadian way of life anymore. Yet they are still in the fore. Welcome to the Canadian Shield. My name's Sterling. I'm your host. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about the separation of Quebec, how it manifested itself, how it began, where it began. And I'm warning you right now, you have to go back to the very beginning to understand that if you don't go back to the very beginning, you will never have a true understanding of what is actually happening and how the Quebecois, or the individual that's living inside of Quebec, is being a little bit played, a little bit manipulated so that they will give their support to people who otherwise would not be getting much support from the population were they to understand the true nature of the evolution of Quebec. Let me just say from the beginning, this is not the CBC, this is the Canadian Shield. Your feelings on the matter are not relevant. The facts are what we are talking about here. Though I admit your feelings are relevant to you, and they are certainly something that might be driving or influencing your way of thinking, I would ask humbly that you focus on the information before you allow your feelings to cloud your judgment, and perhaps you will discover that your feelings have been misplaced. Like I told you, to understand this problem, we must go back to the very beginning, and if for no other reason than the fact that the Quebecois mind goes back to the very beginning when they justify their desire for separation from Canada. You can tell me that Trump's got them up and down. I promise you that this is a strong thread in many parts of Quebec. And if it's been put on pause, that's about the best you can hope for. It will rear its ugly head again. So for those of you that might not have learned it in school, for those of you that are new to the country, for anybody who's just curious to understand, I'm going to break it down for you. 1492, Columbus discovers what you and I hear as the New World. What's often left out, especially when you hear about people how like they want to stop Columbus Day and all of that, is he actually landed in the Bahamas. And much of the stuff that we hear about pirates of the Caribbean and all of that, those kinds of things, are because what we know today is the Caribbean island chains. What we know today is Central and the northern part of South America. Those were where much of that was happening because the weather was better. In 1492, then he went back to Europe and he proved to them that he discovered the New World. He brought some, Aborigines with him, maybe some gold, different products, plant products and things like that. That made the rest of the world want to get over here. Remember, before 1492, the world would sail where they could keep land masses of Europe in their eyesight. Then he got back there, every country in Europe started to scramble to try to get over there and get their hands on the riches and see what else could be found. People now often overlook the fact that Brazil speaks Portuguese because the Portuguese were quite adept at seafaring. However, for Canadians and Canada at large, we have to look at what the French and the English did. So the next important milestone or significant time would have been a fellow by the name of John Cabot. He discovered what today is called Newfoundland. Now, he made 3 trips. On his 3rd trip, he was never heard from again. But that was 1497. So we're already 5 years after what Columbus landed. So you're out there asking yourself, what does this got to do with Quebec separation? And I'm getting there. Though John Cabot discovered Newfoundland in late 1490s, the St. Lawrence Seaway wasn't discovered until 1534. A full 34 years later, it was discovered by a fella by the name of Jacques Cartier. And as the Google puts it here, the explorer Jacques Cartier is credited with the official discovery of the St. Lawrence River in 1535. He named it St. Laurent after the saint of the day, August the 10th. While indigenous peoples had their own names for the river, Cartier's expedition marked the first European encounter and naming of that river. So now you can see what I'm trying to get you to understand. Though Columbus was there at 1492, though we had a lot of exploration going on in the warmer weather, in the northern parts, in the cold parts, in the stormy seas part, there was nothing going on until the French got there in 1535. So 1535, He discovers the mouth of the St. Lawrence. I feel like he got probably as far as PEI, turned around and went back. Took 2 months to travel back and forth. Now, this fellow Jacques Cartier, he made a couple of trips to Canada, and one time he even had an interaction with First Nations individuals. Here's a more detailed look at his contributions. Exploration and mapping. Cartier led 3 voyages between 1534 and 1542, during which he explored and mapped the St. Lawrence River and the surrounding area under the French flag. His explorations provided a basis for France to lay claim to the territory, which would later be known as Canada. You see, from the very beginning, it was a French territory. The French mapped most of the North American continent. This is a relevant situation. So now here we are in 1534. The Spanish and the English and even the French to some extent are fighting over the Caribbean and all of the riches that might be happening there. The exploration of the world has boomed and exploded. They've done all kinds of things to change the shipping and try to figure out how to navigate by the stars and all of those kinds of things. Then this fella comes sailing into the St. Lawrence River and claims what is today, both sides of the river, mind you, what is today Quebec or New Brunswick or different regions of the country for France. Now we get to the part where it's going to start to cause a lot of grief and aggravation for some people, but it's just the facts. So many of us have been taught that it's Plymouth Rock, that it's Jamestown. These are the initial and beginning settlements of the North American continent, despite the fact that the Spaniards and the French and the English and the Portuguese had been down in the Caribbean and whatnot for 100 years already from the 1500s forward. However, we say, oh no, it's Plymouth Rock, it's 1607 for Jamestown. Those are dates that are accurate for the English. They are not accurate for the continent, especially not the North American continent. It's actually the French that made the first settlement in North America. They tried to make one in Quebec in like the 1500s, but they abandoned it. Then they made one in Nova Scotia, what at the time they would have called Acadia, in 1605. Today it's called Annapolis Royal, but at the time it was called Port Royal. It's on the northern part of the peninsula, on the Bay of Fundy. And it was the actual beginning settlement of the North American continent, and it was done so by the French. So I'll quickly give you the Google stuff. The French colony in the New World was Port Royal, established in 1605 in what is now Nova Scotia, Canada. It was part of the larger colony of Acadia. Port Royal was founded in 1605 by Pierre Dugas Dumont and Samuel de Champlain. It was the first permanent French settlement in North America. It's part of the larger French colony of Acadia, which encompasses a vast territory in eastern North America. Essentially what today you and I would know as Nova Scotia and parts of New Brunswick. French exploration of North America began in the 1500s. I covered that. Other early settlements, while Port Royal was the first permanent settlement, there was an earlier short-lived French settlement in the St. Lawrence Valley called Charlebois Royal, which was founded in 1541 and later abandoned. Another important early French settlement was Quebec, founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608. So you can see that they founded Port Royal, then he took a bunch of ships, he sailed them up the St. Lawrence, and he founded another one, Quebec being a very strategic strong point. Now, this is relevant, right, that it's a strategic strong point, that it has a field of view over top of the river of the St. Lawrence. New France. The French colonial empire in North America was known as New France, encompassing a wide range of territory, including Acadia, Canada, Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Louisiana. So here we are at 1608. They've established that it's Quebec City, and the French have laid claim from everything from Nova Scotia, or what they're calling Acadia, down to what we call today Louisiana, New Orleans, up to essentially the Hudson Bay, following the border of, let's say, Manitoba. Then in 1610, the British get blown off course and they land in what's today known as the Hudson Bay, the waters of the Hudson Bay. Let me establish something about the psychology of the time. Nobody wanted to be here. It was cold. It was dark. There was insects that would, the size of birds, black flies that would carry away a small dog, that kind of thing. And nobody wanted to be here at the time, especially the French. They were sending people that were not necessarily high-ranking royals over here, and there were people that were carving out establishments and all of the rest of that. That's 1600, right? Then once the British discovered Hudson Bay and they found all the plethora of supplies that they could bring back to England, because the French had a lot of stuff. The English had nothing. So it was important for them to get those supplies back to the country of England, except for where they were allowed to go without violating French territory was the Hudson Bay, which even today stays frozen sometimes for 2-3 years. So even though they had all of these supplies of beaver pelts and all their kinds of other things, they couldn't get it back to the continent because they were locked in. Now, in those days, we would have travel by canoe, right? The canoe is a North American invention. It was invented by the First Nation. So they would travel all of the riverways by canoe. Now, you can put a canoe, a body of water, a boat in Kingston, sail up some rivers in a canoe, come out at Ottawa, sail down some rivers and through Lachine, and you're in Montreal. Once you're in Montreal, you can put in a deep water boat and you can sail much of the supplies up to St. Lawrence, past Cape Breton, and onwards into Europe, where you can sell it to other markets. This is a relevant thing. This is very important because at the time, it was all controlled by the French. So the English would be sitting up there in the Hudson Bay waiting to get their supplies back to Europe to make their money and all the rest of it. The French, however, the voyageurs, had control of everything from Montreal all the way up to, well, all the way to France, technically. So now that we've established that, let me say to all of you that are listening, to the Quebecois, to many people from Quebec, they're taught that the language is the issue, that it's all about French versus the English. From the English side of the argument, it has always been about control of the river. The amount of freight that moves up the St. Lawrence is only dwarfed by the Suez Canal. It's the largest amount of freight in the world. I mean, I suppose there's a lot moving up the Yangtze in China, but you get my point. It's right up there. It's a lot of stuff that feeds the interior of the continent, or more importantly, removes the resources out of the interior of the continent and sells them to other markets. It's never been about the French language. The English language is 40% French. The royalty of England, most of them were from France as of 1066. The courts and many of the laws of the land were all laid down in French right up until like probably the 1700s. So it's never been about the language, though I get that that's what you're told in school and whatnot. All right, having said all of that, so let's lay the groundwork. Here we are in the early 1600s, 1610. The British discovered they discovered the Hudson Bay. They named it the Hudson Bay. They start pulling resources out, hoping that they can get them back to England. The French start to make inroads. Instead, they start to make relationships with the First Nations. They begin to intermingle, spawning what today is known as the Métis. I'll do that in a different video. This video is not about the Métis and it's not about the Acadians, so don't come at me. Then we come forward 100 years. Now the establishments are settling in. There's a lot of trade going on, but still nobody from France was really that interested in coming to what was by this time known as New France or Acadia, depending on, which part of the continent that you were in. And the English were still very much isolated to the northern part of the continent up into what today is called Hudson Bay, and, giving us the story called the Bay. Now we come 100 years forward, right? We're in the early 1700s. There's a battle and there's a war in Europe called the War of Spanish Succession. And that ended in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. Now, I can't describe to you how important this document is to the Canada that we live in today. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed, I believe Utrecht is in the Netherlands, and it had all the main players in it: the English, the French, the Dutch, the Austrians, the Spanish. There was a lot of things that changed hands during this time because of, that's how you settled wars in those days. The winner go the spoils, right? Okay, so here we are, early 1700s. There's a war in Europe. And in North America, we have the Spanish in the Caribbean. We have the Portuguese in the Caribbean. We have the 13 colonies of the British along the coast of the United States. We have some of the British up around the Hudson Bay, and everything else is French, everything else. Then there's a war in in Europe, involving all of the major players. That results in the Treaty of Utrecht, and I will tell you here first a breakdown of what it is according to Google, and then I will tell you the significant parts to Canada. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, was a series of peace agreements that ended the War of Spanish Succession. It primarily involved France, Spain, Great Britain, but also other European powers like the Netherlands and Austria. The treaty recognized the succession of Philip V to the Spanish throne and led to significant territorial and colonial changes. And there's a lot of stuff there. I will come down to territorial changes. Great Britain gained. The third one down, Great Britain acquired Newfoundland, Acadia. Then they put in brackets Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. and the Hudson Bay Territory. So in 1713, when they signed the Treaty of Utrecht, because the British had beaten the French, they said, you know what, you're going to give us what is today known as Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but at the time was referred to as Acadia, and you're going to give us the Hudson Bay. This lays the groundwork for where the problem actually arises, because at this time they lose what's known as Acadia, and there's the gigantic Acadia exodus that ends up most people leaving Acadia and going down to New Orleans, where today gives us the people known as the Cajuns. Again, different. That's not going to be covered in this video. However, Quebec, the new France, was still fairly hale, and it went essentially from what today is the province of Quebec well deep into the United States. Okay, so now we're coming to the meat of it. Now we have established that the French were in control of much of the continent, that technically the English didn't take Canada away from the First Nations. They took North America, or they took Canada away from the French. Then there was another war, which many will call the First World War, the first global conflagration. In the United States of America, it is referred to as the French Indian War. In the rest of the world, it is referred to as the 7 Years' War. They are the same conflict. They are the reason that they speak Portuguese in Brazil, because the Portuguese were on the side of the British, and the British won this battle, this war. That is a relevant thing, this 7 Years' War, which established a few guidelines, and it ended in 1763. Then in 1774, they passed what was called the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act was a direct response to the lack of establishment that happened during the 7 Years' War. Now, once the 7 Years' War, the dust was settled, the British didn't care about the province of Quebec at all, because they took control of Montreal and they took control of Cape Breton, which allowed, well, they took control of Cape Breton a little sooner than that, but which allowed them to get the products out of the interior of the continent and over to Europe. That's all that mattered to them, was the river. It never, ever, ever mattered about the French versus the English language. Not at all. I appreciate that many people in Quebec are taught that. However, they had to settle this battle because Quebec City, from its at the time, had a very commanding view of the river, and any ship sailing out of Montreal could easily have been bombarded from Quebec City, so they had to settle that dispute. Then they went into this massive negotiation of this contract and were hammering out things in Europe that were impacting North America. And what they finally came through with 11 years later in 1774, 2 years fully before the American Revolution, they handed down what was called the Quebec Act. Two significant things out of the Quebec Act. One, they enlarged Quebec into much of the province, the country, which is what today known as west of the Appalachians. So that really upset the 13 colonies, because they kind of liked that territory. They had begun moving there. And how it impacts Canada and separation is it gave the French in Quebec the right to practice Catholicism. Idea that the French were Catholic and the English were Protestant or Anglican was a significant change, was a significant impact culturally, socially. French language meant nothing. That you were a different religion, oh my goodness, that is a big, big deal. It's still kind of a big deal in many places of the country, of the world, excuse me. Though in North America, we have tried to remove it as being significant. I would point to Ireland and how they've only been at peace for a few years, fighting over the fact that they are of different religion, though they are both Christians. Both religions being Christian, one being Catholic, one being Protestant, one had the Anglican language. This was an important factor and one of the main drivers to why separation is not what they believe that it is. Because then in 1774, they said, you know what, you're allowed to be Catholic, no problem whatsoever, and you're allowed to have people to hold office that are represented by the French language. Unfortunately, for what happened was the Catholic Church became the buffer. They became the English here, then the Catholic Church, and then the French speakers. So over the course of the next 200 years, the Catholic Church got pretty wealthy and pretty powerful in the province of Quebec, what is today known as the province of Quebec. due to the fact that they were acting as the liaisons between the go-betweens between the French culture and the English culture, especially in places like Montreal or along the riverbank and of the St. Lawrence. Again, it's always been about the St. Lawrence. It's never been about anything else. This held until the Second World War, when people from the French side could see that the English had a lot more money. What was going on was the French were getting paid the same, but the Catholic Church was taking quite a large tithe. How would this look in every day? This means that the English were coming along and they were building mines and they were investing a lot of infrastructure into Quebec, and they were having to go through the intermediary of the Catholic Church, and then the Catholic Church would pay the workers or would pay the individuals that were involved in any of the labor. They would keep a big piece of the Catholic Church, and that was keeping the French population poor. So in the 60s, they had a little thing, what was known as the Quiet Revolution, where they turned away from the Catholic Church. They stopped attending the Catholic Church. A lot of profanity entered the French language, which was tied directly to the church. Easily, smoothly moved over to a little organization called the FLQ, the Front Liberation of Quebec, who are a terrorist organization who were planting bombs all over the city of Montreal. They did a lot of stuff that would be considered today quite wrong. Of course, in the middle of all of that, there was a lot of political upheaval, and they had to turn the people away from the Liberal Party, and they had to turn the people away from the Conservative Party. And they began, as an offshoot of the FLQ, the Parti de Québécois, which is the separatist organization. Now there is another one, but this is the separatist organization that was originally tasked with separating Quebec from Canada. Now they have the Bloc Québécois, they have the Parti de Québécois, they have the CAQ, who is currently in charge. And there's a lot of internal strife that goes on in Quebec. But they do it all. They drive their vote by saying to you that it's the English versus the French. They never say that it's the Catholics versus the Protestants, because that would be the truth. They never say that it's the fact that we lost the war 3-4 times. They never say that it's the fact that they gave up the territory in France. They never talk about any of that. When the French asked a few hundred years ago, when the French wrote a letter to France, when the Québécois wrote a letter to France asking for assistance, the French said, "We don't worry about the stables while the house is on fire," because they were losing the same war in Europe and they just didn't want to be here. They don't talk about any of that, right? They just try to tell you that it's all about your French language. It's all about speaking French. They pass ridiculous laws that force people that are English in the house to speak French out in public. They have Canada's only secret police, known as the language police. They don't have marked cars. They don't have uniforms. They just walk around with a little badge in their pocket. They have the right to claim your house. They have the right to shut your business down. They come after people for having English posts on Facebook. I mean, it is pretty out there. Every time that they don't get what they want, they just start to say separation, and the Liberal Party buckles. They buckle right under because they get a lot of votes out of the Quebec province, and that ends up giving Quebec a disproportionate amount of influence in the country, actually. So, despite the fact that they get $13 billion in equalization payments from the rest of the country, they try to say that they want to separate. Then Trump says, "You know what? I'm had enough of Canada," and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, help us, Ottawa, help protect us, Canada." So it irritates me. I'll be completely frank with you. I don't believe that separation. Like, if you were in a relationship with somebody and every day they come home and they said, "Do as I said or I'm leaving you, do as I say or I'm leaving you," I would change the locks, or I would simply leave. I would be like, "You know what? I don't want to hear it anymore. Get out." But I understand that there's a lot of people that are being misled by the information that they have been provided from small childhood. How every time that something goes wrong, it's not that the country of France let you go. It's not that the Catholic Church steered you wrong. No. It's all because somebody in Toronto or Ontario did something to you. And that, in the nutshell, is the issue behind separation. It started in the 1960s, after all of these years of up and down and back and forth. In their minds, they try to make it all about the French language because that was the only difference that mattered in the 60s, right? From that, there's been other evolutions. We come in forward to Meech Lake, and then there's the Bloc that was decided to be a federal party. And that's just a different kind of thing. All of it stems from what I have just described to you, right? It all stems from the Quebec Act of 1774 or the Treaty of Utrecht in the Spanish War of Succession, the 7 Years' War. These are that laid the groundwork for the French sections of the continent to be trimmed down so where the English could get a hold of the St. Lawrence River, which is why they didn't care that you wanted to maintain your Catholicism, because nobody wanted to be here. They just wanted to take all of the resources. There was no culture. There was no 100-year-old buildings. There was none of that stuff. It was essentially First Nations, rivers, and woods. And a winter that would just break you, right? So they just wanted the resources. They wanted control of the river, and they said, you can have the rest. And then they got manipulated in the 60s into believing that it was all about the French language, and it's never been about the French language. So now when you go into Quebec and you try to speak English, they target your software, they target your YouTube channel, they target they target your Facebook channel. If you're making money in the province of Quebec and you're doing it with the English letters that are even the same size as the French letters, they will come after you. One of the most famous faux pas was when they tried to shut down a restaurant for using the word spaghetti, which is technically an Italian word, which of course is a Latin language, just like French. I won't get into that in this video. I just wanted to use many of you that might not understand what the big deal is to understand that it's just people being misled and led astray by small groups of individuals who are trying to control the masses through ignorance rather than through information. All right, I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.